So chapter 6, I've pulled that PowerPoint down off Canvas, and I have it here. It is exciting and wonderfully white background as it is. We're going to look at subqueries, and this is like our last query chapter. After this, we have our first unit exam. That's all about select statements and querying. And then after that unit exam, we'll start working on updating the database, inserting new rows into our table and modifying the rows that are there. So we'll be done with just querying things. But this last section is really important, and it's subqueries. So a subquery is a select statement that contains a select statement. So whenever we're looking at a subquery, we can have another query in our where clause, or in our having clause, or in our from clause, or in our select clause. So let's look at one. Here's a subquery they've given us. I'm going to try to get SQL Management Studio open because I have it all mad. Get to my database. And I'm going to open a new query. I got to reset my Windows. I got something messed up. There we go. Okay. So in our query here, we're going to have a subquery within our where clause. So we're going to start out by coding this subquery, this inner query first. So I want to create that one so that we can see what kind of results it's going to give us. So we're going to select the average, bless you, of our invoice total amount from our invoices table. Now we know when we run that from all of our new summary query knowledge, aggregate query, that that's going to result in one column, one number, right? So we've got the average of all of the invoices. And the DBMS did a whole lot of work behind the scenes, right? It ran through all of the invoices, it summarized them all into a total field, it counted them all so it could divide to get that average, and it gave us that average. So that's the result of our query. Now we would like to find all of the invoices that have an invoice total that's larger than that average. So we need to first dynamically get that average and then use it to select all of the invoices that have an invoice total greater than that. So the easiest way is for us to use a subquery. So for a subquery, we take our inner query and we put it within parentheses. So that's going to be the first thing, because it's going to be wrapped in parentheses. Then we're going to put our outer query. We want to select the invoice number, invoice date, and invoice total. From invoices. Where our invoice total is greater than the output from the select statement. So I'm going to kind of indent that under our where clause. So we notice that that is part of our where clause. Now in our example, they added an order by clause. So I'll add that in. So we want to see our highest invoice down. So we would call this query something like invoice is greater than average or something like that. Let's execute it. So our average came out to 1879.74. We shouldn't see anything that is not greater than that. And our total should be in descending sequence. There we go. Now I'm seeing everything. Perfect. We stopped right there. Okay, so let's put some comments in that query. This query includes a subquery. So the subquery is executed first, right? Has to be by the DBMS. The results are then used to complete the outer query. So this one's pretty basic because our inner query, our nested query, is only going to return one thing, that one column. So it's almost the same as us saying where invoice total greater than some number that we just typed in, right? Because that's what we're getting back out of this where clause. It's just one number to compare to. But we have a lot of power here because we can have a select statement that results in more than one thing, right? And then we could use all of those things in our outer query to process stuff. So I think you can.
Would you mind scrolling down a bit so I can see the results?
Sure. You guys will have to see how far you can go without breaking it. So our last one should be 1927, which is getting close to our average. I'm going to save that one. And this one is going to be my invoice total subquery. So nice and clear that one is because we get our single value. So in the presentation, they talk a little bit about it. If your subquery returns a single value, you could put that subquery anywhere an expression is allowed. So the where clause, the having clause, many different things. Could you put it in the select statement? You could actually put it in the select statement. We'll see that too. Now, if we have a result set that results in a single column, but up many of them, we can use that in place of a list. And if we have one or more columns that could have many of them, we can use that in place of a table in the from clause. So we can get pretty wild here. Let's try this one. We're going to create a query that uses an inner join first. Let's create a new query. The first thing we'd like to do is create an inner join. We're going to select the invoice number, invoice date, and invoice total again. We want to join our vendors table. On our invoices.vendor ID equaling our vendor.vendor ID. they only want to see vendors in California. And we know we have a lot of vendors in California. So poorly named. I don't know why I want it to be singular. So California, and we're going to order it by invoice date. Okay, so in our inner join then, we should see all of the invoices that come from vendors in California. Now, we're not seeing anything about the vendor, so we would have to do some other querying to validate our results. But we'll assume it's all valid because we're getting it from the text, right? So here we're getting everybody that is in California. I'm looking, I do have the same results as them for the first few. It looked like I didn't. All right, so now let's take this inner join and let's make it into a subquery instead. I'm going to go down below that and just create another new query. So this is going to be the same query using a subquery instead of that inner join. So again, we're going to select our invoice number, our invoice date, our invoice total from our invoices. But instead of doing that join, we're going to use the where clause. And we're going to use a new keyword in. So our in keyword says where the vendor ID is in this list of vendor IDs that I'm going to supply for you. So let's supply a list of vendor IDs. We're going to select vendor ID from our vendors table, where the vendor state equals California. Right. And then finally, we're going to order by invoice date. So I'm looking down here, I should get the same stuff. This $95 invoice should be first. I'm going to select our new query to run it. Make sure it runs, and it did run okay. Okay, so look at those two. Which one do you prefer?
Join's a little easier to read.
Is it easier to read?
Okay, you have to like read it, like have a whole different select line, figure out what's tying in. I think the join is kind of like, oh, you're grabbing vendor ID from invoices, comparing to the vendor's vendor ID, returning that.
I like it. What they say is the advantages of the joins are the join operation can include columns from both tables. So that's a big deal because we wouldn't necessarily be able to do that with our subquery. The join tends to be more intuitive. That's what Cohen is saying. When it uses an existing relationship between the two tables, it just seems like it makes more sense. It's easier to read and understand. And a query with a join typically performs faster too, because as the database management system navigates the tables, it knows about that relationship, and so it takes advantage of it. Now, the subqueries, though, have some advantages too. The subquery could pass an aggregate value like that average invoice total. The subqueries tend to be more intuitive, like make more sense when they're using an ad hoc relationship. So like that crazy relationship we have between the customer and the address table, they're saying a subquery might make more sense when we're working with that. And then long complex queries could be easier to code using subqueries. So I could see it both ways. To me, they seem kind of overly complicated, but that's just me. So let's try another one. Let's save this one here. And I'm going to call this one subquery versus inner join. Okay, so another new one then. In this example, I'm going to write our subquery first. We're going to do a select distinct vendor ID from invoices. Okay, so tell me about this query. Do I need that distinct keyword? Mm-hmm. Because if I leave it out, I'm going to get multiples of each vendor, right? I'm going to run it. Yeah, 34, 34, 37, 37, 37. Why am I getting more than each vendor more than one time? Since I'm using the invoices table, I could have multiple invoices for any given vendor. So since we're using that invoices table, we need to use the distinct keyword if we are in a situation where we only want to see each vendor once. So if I can type that properly, I'll try running this. And now I should see that I've eliminated all of those duplicates. So now I can use this as a list of vendor IDs. I can use it as a subquery. So let's put parentheses around it. And the query I want to wrap it in is going to select vendor ID, vendor name, and vendor state from vendors where vendor ID not in. So what kind of results is that going to give us? We said this select statement is resulting in a list of all the vendors that have invoices. So what kind of vendors are we looking for if we're looking for ones that aren't in that list?
Are these vendors that don't have any invoices?
Yes. So this is just a way that we can find out somebody that doesn't have any, because that's a really hard question to ask in a query. How do I know? Okay, so this is an important one because our not in clause can tell us how many, patients we have that have never been in the hospital, or all those kinds of questions that we might have about our data that we can't gather unless we know there's nothing there. And SQL doesn't like it if there's nothing there. Let's run this and make sure it's working right. So I shouldn't see that 34 in there because he had invoices for sure. And sure enough, he's not in there. So we could go through and see how it's kind of a large list. It's not something that we would want to go through and manually find. Check Expedata. Do they have any invoices? No, add them to our list. So this query gives us that result. So let's put some comments in here. Subquery selects all vendor IDs that have invoices The not in clause specifies we want all of the other vendors that aren't in that list. So we're going to take that list, we're going to use it as our basis. Now on this one, again, we can restate this as a join because we want to be sure we know all these things. So in our join, we can select vendors.vendor ID, vendor name, vendor state, to from vendors, left join invoices. Try to get this right. This will be an ugly one. On vendors.vendor ID equal invoices.vendor ID. And then finally, our where clause that's going to cause us to get vendors that don't have invoices is going to say that we want a vendor ID null. And my S has that. Now you should get the same result out of this join query. I've got to say in this example, I kind of agree with our book that the subquery is a little bit clearer to understand. But if you were doing this kind of left joining all the time to get vendors that don't have invoices, then this would be more meaningful to you because that's what you were used to. Either way, we're getting that left join output where we're going to get all of the vendors and then we're going to limit that to ones that don't have invoices. Let's save this one. And this will be a subquery using the not in. Now, in this case, we were using our where clause and we were looking at the special not in syntax. We don't necessarily have to do that. Let's try one more. This one is kind of a long one. In this one, we're going to use that invoice total minus payment total minus credit total calculation. And we're going to call it balance due. Put in our from clause, and hopefully all those errors should disappear. Yeah. Now in our where clause, we're going to use this calculation about 12 more times. So can we use that term balance due in our where clause instead? No, it won't let us, will it? So we have to type that whole formula again. We're going to put an and clause and type that formula again. I just kind of wish they had carried this in the database instead of calculating it every time, but I'm sure it's more efficient this way. Okay, so in our where clause, we're going to add a subquery. So we've got everything set now where we're going to get only those invoices that we still owe on. They have a total greater than 0. But now we're going to add additional criteria. So we've been doing this where they're greater than 0 since like chapter 3 or whatever. But now we want to add more. So now we're going to select a summary query. We want to select the average of our invoice total minus our payment total, minus our credit total. From our invoices table. And one more time. Speed typing. Exactly. Yeah. That'll work. So what are we saying here? What is our and clause? Yes?
It sounds like you're pulling up all of the invoices that have some amount on them, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
but are less than whatever the average is. So the people who have just a little bit on there, comparatively speaking.
Oh, that are almost paid off. That looks right.
More or
So
less.
all of the ones that are less than our average. So let's run this inner query. I'm going to select it. And I'm going to have to select it without those parentheses and see if I can execute just that one. Because I'd been kind of doing that separately and I didn't hear today. So our average is about $2,900. That's how much we owe on average. So now if we run the entire thing, we should only see ones that are less than that. There's our balance due. And they're substantially less too, aren't they? So. Questions about that one? Does it make sense? So let's put a comment or two here. Our subquery selects invoices. Oh, selects the average due on our invoices. Then our primary query selects all invoices where due amount is less than the average. Okay, before we break for labs, I'd like to talk about the all keyword. Let's save this one. And this is going to be a subquery in our where clause. And of course, our not in was also in the where clause. Where is that subquery? Silly subquery. Okay, so we want to look at this special keyword. Besides not in, we have another new keyword called all. And they have some information for us about how the all keyword works. And I want you to take a second and take a look at this. Does that make sense? The way they have it presented. They do a pretty good job. So they're saying that if you use the all keyword and you have a set that contains the values 1 and 2, then for X to meet the condition of being greater than all of those, X must be greater than 2. That makes sense? Because 2 is the highest in that list. Okay? Now, if I'm looking at this where I'm saying X must be less than all of them, X has to be less than 1, because 1 is the smallest in that list. Now, if I'm saying X has to equal all of them, X has to be 1 and 2, kind of not really possible, right? But we could have situations where we have things there that let us use that. And then if we use a not equal condition, this is more like our not in syntax, then we're saying X is not 1 and X is not 2. So if X were 3, it would qualify for that. So this all keyword is letting us create conditions that are related to entire set of data from our subquery. So let's look at this one. We'll create this one. We've got a subquery where we're going to get the invoice total for vendor ID 34. It's just that one vendor. We have it hard-coded in our query that we're going to get that invoice total for vendor ID 34. Then we're going to query and get all of the invoices and a little bit of vendor information for any invoices where their total is greater than all of the ones in this select statement. So if vendor ID 34 has 2 invoices, there's going to be 2 of them that it has to be greater than. If vendor ID had 40 invoices, there would be 40 of them that it would have to be greater than. So let's start with that subquery. So in our subquery, we're going to select the invoice total from our invoices table. Where the vendor ID equals 34. So we have 2 of them, 2 invoices. So those 2 invoices will be our list. So I'm going to wrap this in parentheses to make it into a subquery. And I'm going to put a query around it. I'm going to select the vendor name, the invoice number, and the invoice total. From our invoices table. We're going to join our vendors table. So our syntax is a little weird because we're going to have this all keyword. I'll indent all of that. And then finally at the very end, let's order by vendor name. So could I have this all keyword without a subquery? Not really, huh? I mean, it's kind of dependent on the fact that what follows is going to be a list of things. So we know our list is going to have these two things in it, that subquery list, 116.54 and 1083.58. So if we execute this now, we should only see invoices that are greater than that. Is that what it's saying? Are we only going to see invoices for vendor ID 34, or are we going to see invoices for all of the vendors? All of the vendors, because it's only our subquery that's limited to vendor ID 34. We're using his invoices, though, for our query. So let's run it. And so we should never see any invoices whose total is less than those amounts. And we can tell we do have a very limited number. So that gives us a lot of power. So let's put a comment here. This is a query that uses the all keyword, is how they have it in the book. Our subquery gets the invoice total for vendor ID 34. Our outer query then gets all invoices whose total is greater. Okay, that's our all keyword. Let's save that. And we'll practice a little bit more because we'll be adding some additional keywords. So I'm going to save this one as vendor subquery all. So we have some other fancy keywords to use. And I'm looking at our chapter 5 turn in, and it looks like some people are hoping to have time today, and we always have. So I want to, this chapter is a little bit longer than some of our others, and we want to get it done and out of our way so we can get done with the unit. But it does have some really important stuff too. So we really want an opportunity to look at all of the different options and think about them. So let's go ahead and break and work on lab stuff. You guys can get with your teams to finish up this chapter's stuff that's due tonight, or you can start on working on the subquery problems that'll be due next Tuesday. So either way, whatever you would like to work on. How are the quizzes going? Are they pretty straightforward with Maroc? I mean, they don't have any really weird questions, do they? They're okay? Good. Those Java ones, people are complaining. Eat them. Okay, lab time.
Already,